don't know what to say after that, Rainey. Thank you very much indeed. What comes now is a letdown. I have had many wonderful experiences with the Max Planck Institute, and Rainey Daston has been a luminous intellectual model for me all the way through. I also have to thank Franz for showing up magically a year ago in Chicago when I was hosting Amitav Ghosh for dinner, when he was speaking about giving us the talks that became The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And Franz, this magical person, appears, and suddenly the dinner party is alight, and we are all talking at the very top of our game. So thank you very much. So when I was putting together this talk, I was troubled as to how to pitch it. I have talked to many audiences who know nothing about the Anthropocene, for whom that word is a mystery, including last year I was invited over by the government of South Korea, and one of the things I did was speak to their diplomats in training, one of the most creme de la creme groups that just happened to be more than 50% women, by the way. And not one of them had heard the term Anthropocene, but when I started explaining it, they knew exactly what I meant. I gather that this is not what I need to do tonight, so I will not be doing much of that. I've also been curious as to what I needed to say about Japan. So I'm assuming that we don't have many Japan scholars in the audience. However, now I find that we do, and I can be corrected on Japan. I can't simply make that up, but I will try to pitch that correctly as well. And then there's the question of theory, theories of history in particular, because that is really the core question I want to ask this evening, which is, if our future looks nothing like our past because of the Anthropocene, what is the point in being an historian? Are we simply dilettantes? Are we simply tellers of tales with no contemporary purchase? And so that's the main question of this talk. What are historians to do now? And you know what this problem is. We can talk through Earth system sciences about the Anthropocene in three ways. We can discuss the Anthropocene in terms of the planetary boundaries, which we have overwhelmed, or we can talk about it in terms of the great acceleration, the 24 indicators from populations to McDonald's restaurants that have pushed us over the edge, or we can talk in terms of geostratigraphy and the very concept of the Anthropocene as being locatable in the geological time scale. And each of these suggests that we have ruptured the Earth system, and our world going forward is unprecedented, unpredictable, and largely irreversible. So the question is then, what is the use of history if this future is so different from our past? And I want to talk a little bit before I plunge into this about what I mean by history, because of course one always takes upon oneself the liberty of defining one's discipline, knowing full well that there are other people in the room who don't think about it in those terms. But I think of history as a political practice, as a practice that looks at the past in order to imagine the future differently, to denature the present, so that we might understand that the ways we live now are not necessary ways, are not inevitable ways, but are ways that could be rethought. And so for me, history has always been not simply descriptive, but it's been theoretical and analytical. That's what I think history is. But let's be clear about where history in general is in the world today. This problem that the Anthropocene confronts us with, this radical dislocation of the Anthropocene, comes at a very bad time for historians. At least in the States, maybe you all are doing fine in Germany, but our enrollments are plummeting. Many history requirements are being removed from the books. My own university has decided that, oh, well, history's not really necessary. We'll give people a touch of the humanities before they go off and join the neoliberal economy, but not too much. We wouldn't want to have too much in the way of history. And people in general, I think, are no longer placing themselves, understanding themselves as the product of history. At best, everything is now or yesterday. We no longer locate our present with the past. And François Hartog perhaps has put this most eloquently when he argues that our grand plans and hopes for the future have been replaced by caution and risk aversion. The future has become a threat, not a promise. And as he says, with our future closed off, the past has been engulfed in shadow, and the present has become our sole horizon. No longer does history provide master narratives. History, that is the modern concept of history, on which Europe has lived for 2 centuries, has lost its strength, its majesty, and concretely, its signature operational efficiency. Now, Hartog makes this analysis by looking at a purely European past and by looking at the Holocaust. So while I take on, indeed, his analysis resonates with me, that we have, in fact, come at the end of the grand narrative, and we are, in fact, in a kind of ambient presentism, I think he's missed the reason that we are there. And I think that reason has to do with the Anthropocene, with the fact that the grand narrative has slammed against planetary boundaries, and that our great hopes for increasing abundance and greater equality in abundance have now been diminished by the fact that we are already using 1.4 or 1.5 planets worth per year, depending on who you look at. And yet, there are so many people who have so little. And indeed, even at this rate, were we to divide the world's wealth by the world's population, we would have something like roughly $5,000 per head. So the great promise, this great narrative, has indeed run into shallow waters. We have indeed perhaps achieved the moment, achieved is not the right word here. We've hit against the moment where it's very hard for history to figure out how to go forward, how that it can have the anticipatory content that Koselleck gave it, the political function that it gave it. And I think we have to ask ourselves why it had that political function and why it was filled with anticipatory content. And the reason, which Koselleck had already pointed to earlier, is the fact that history, late Holocene history, as I'll call it here, was actually able to divide histories of nature from human history. And I'm sure many of you have worked along these lines and will see what I'm driving at here. What is interesting is that this divorce of history and nature happened both in Japan and in the West. As history was formalized and became a university discipline, historians began to speak of agency and those people with agency, and began to forget those people without agency and those actions that are not actions, but simply receptivity. For instance, the air we breathe, the soil we live off of, the microbes in our bodies. This kind of passivity, what we receive, was dismissed from history. And those people who were deemed to be natural in these ways were also dismissed from history. And what is interesting to me is that late 19th century formation has clung to our discipline to this very day. When you do analyses of universities and say what places are studied in your departments, they are the places where history could be divorced from nature, or at least was thought to be divorced from nature in the 19th century, so that Europe rose above the rest, certainly in the views of Hegel, who described Africa as the gold land with lacking all history, and Asia as having history only in that the one was free, the despot, the Asian despot, but that these places did not, in fact, have history. And what's interesting is how strong that disposition has remained in Western universities, such that in English universities, for instance, only 16% of historians look outside Western Europe and North America and the UK, and only 2% of them bother with East Asian history. And what is equally odd is that this is, in some strange way, true in Japan as well. In Japan, about 40% of Japanese historians are interested in Japan, which is about the same number of UK historians interested in the UK. And as in the UK, more than 40% of Japanese historians are interested in Europe. So in Japan and in the West, what is so remarkable is that history is the history of a few people who think they can divorce themselves from nature and seem to transcend nature, telling a different story which could stress agency and production, not reproduction, so that you could get a linear narrative which was not chronicles or cycles, and which could in some fundamental way deny natural determinism. Because one of the greatest sins of a historian, as perhaps you found out, is to suggest in any way, shape, or form that there is anything determined about human life by nature. And should you mention, for instance, that we all die, this is taken as an irrelevant and indeed an irreverent comment, because that is not what history is about in some way. And I say this in a way that's sort of over the top, I realize, but I think many of you have had experiences when you've tried to suggest the ways in which nature might re-enter history that will confirm the resistance of our field to the reintroduction of nature, and to the difficulties then that are posed as we face the Anthropocene and we say, if we're going to move from late Holocene history, as I want to call our profession, to a new kind of history, to an Anthropocene history, we're going to have different protocols, different ideas of agency that include passivity, different archives, including natural ones, different means of representation. We need to be suspicious of narratives and what they do. And sadly, we need to come at history with diminished hopes. No longer can we tell, as Benedetto Croce did, the story of liberty and assume that that is where history is, the direction history is going in. No longer can we hope with Reinhard Koselleck that history can create hopes for the future by denaturalizing time. And I show you here some covers of history books in Japan, and they have this marvelous narrative. My favorite one is from the Stone Age to superpower, but from prehistory to modern times is pretty good. You all know this kind of implicit notion that history is going in a direction and it's going to developed countries. This is where history should be heading, and if it's not, we need to take these underdeveloped places and make them better. And Japan is always asserting itself as one of those places that has made it into history, despite the fact that many Western historians don't know about us. So what I want to do now is try to think through with you a little bit about what Anthropocene history might look like, giving you an example of Japan. And I want to stress two notions here. One is resilience, and the other is well-being within closed systems. I choose the word resilience because I like the way it includes the notion of constant change. There's something about sustainability, the very term that suggests that you're going to have a stable system, and if you can just adjust everything correctly, it's going to stay that way. There's a kind of lack of understanding that the world we're facing in, with its many unpredictable tipping points, are not going to allow us to think in terms of efficient systems anymore that can maximize our capacity to control, because we don't know yet what we're going to have to control. We don't know yet many of the things that are coming at us, because we don't know yet how many greenhouse gases, for instance, that we are going to pour into the environment, or how many human beings will be inhabiting this planet by 2100. So resilience, I want to say, it's about the maintenance of certain systems of decency over time in the face of change. So this is the aim now of history, to move from stories of liberty to decency with resilience. A very diminished hope, I admit, but perhaps something we can manage. And as we look for that, as we look for resilience with decency, we begin to think perhaps in terms of well-being rather than GDP. GDP, the numbers from GDP have mesmerized us. This is what politicians give us. This is what we should all hope for. This will tell us whether we're doing well or poorly. But as many of you know, so often it tells us only what we've exchanged on the market. It says very little about our health. It says very little about the vegetables we grow in our garden. It says very little about the kindnesses we extend to one another in cooking one another wonderful dinners, and giving each other the odd tomato, or taking care of one another's children. So I want us to therefore transfer our thoughts to resilience and to well-being within the closed system of the earth when we're thinking about when we're thinking about Anthropocene history, a critical Anthropocene history. But I also want to use that formula of resilience and well-being within a closed system to talk about Tokugawa Japan in the early modern period between 1600 and 1868. And because there happen to be people in the audience who know a great deal about Japan, I can't go through this part too quickly. If you didn't know anything about Japan, I would simply say that Japan had a fairly closed system. But amongst Japanese historians, this is a dangerous thing to say. So let me explain what I mean. These islands around 1600 had just suffered from a century of warfare. And when the Tokugawa shogunate came into power, they decided that peace is in their interests. And when they did so, they decided that one of the things that gave them peace was great control over Japan's connections with the outside world. And what they did was they decided that people could not leave Japan. And they decided that contact in terms of trade, and even more so in terms of diplomacy with the outside world, would be extremely limited and controlled. And so there were only about 6,000 ships that came in the 250 wrong zero in there, 250-year period, which means there were about 2 ships a month coming to Japan, mostly from China, 1 a year from Holland, which everybody makes a huge deal of, and shipping some from Korea. And so Japan wasn't entirely closed from the world. It did have connections with the islands to the south in the Ryukyu island chain. It did have connections with the larger island to the north, the Okinawan island. Yet people couldn't leave, and Japan couldn't import food. So that during this time, during this 250-year period, they had to live within the bounds of these islands in terms of daily supplies, in terms of the things you eat, the clothes you wear, most of the things you'd ever see or have in your life, unless you were very much part of the elite. It also, interestingly enough, meant that there was relatively little disease coming in. In fact, cholera didn't reach Japan until the 1820s, I think that's right, and you were protected from the outside as well as thwarted in desires to go outside. But during this time, Japan, like the rest of the world, suffered from environmental dislocations, from great change during the Little Ice Age, when the world plummeted to its lowest global average temperatures around 1640 and then again in 1690. Japan, too, suffered from those famines. But as Jeffrey Parker's book has let us know, it managed to do so with enormous resilience. Whereas in the 17th century, 1/3 of the world's population died, and Europe was plunged into nearly constant warfare, and China spent the entire century fighting, Japan had only 4 years of fighting and 96 years of peace, and the population actually grew. So Japan suffered from climate change and yet was resilient. That's one of the interesting points here. It also suffered from many other natural disasters. Volcanoes, there was the Uzen volcano in 1792 that caused all sorts of damage, but it also, of course, suffered from volcanoes, the outcome of which came from other places. Earthquakes, of course, typhoons, fires. There was a fire that destroyed 2/3 of the capital of Edo, which is now Tokyo, in 1657. Many crop failures. So Japan was by no means ecologically stable, nor are these islands ecologically stable. They have extremely steep volcanic slopes, covered with volcanic soil, very heavy rainfall, and monsoons that, should those hillsides have been denuded, would have meant landslides and loss of topsoil at such a rate that the Japanese agricultural system could not have sustained itself. So they had to practice forestry well in order to keep those mountains intact, in order to save the small percentage, 15% arable land that they had to grow their crops on. So I don't want you to come away from this talk thinking, Japan, the blessed isles of peace and prosperity, because they love nature and nature is calm and loves them. That is not the answer here. Instead, what I want to point to is the extraordinary and very complex systems, including governance, and many other things, including material practices, and sanitation practices, and ideological practices, and publishing practices, and many other facets of this society, which I cannot tell you about because I can only talk for 3 hours, right? That somehow managed to work together through a lot of sheer luck to produce a system which survived for 250 years with resilience and well-being and, extraordinarily enough, peace. That is something we need to think about, that will help us perhaps to imagine a way forward, because they did this without fossil fuels, of course, without capitalism, without many of the things that we think are necessary to well-being, to life in general. So let me give a brief and no doubt inadequate description of how this bizarre governance system worked in Tokugawa Japan. When the Tokugawa shogunate came to power, it did not do so by being able to control the entire island. It won the Battle of Sekigahara only by making its enemies say uncle, but not being able to strip them, the other great lords, entirely of their power. And so you got a very strong state, but a state that was decentralized in that in the domains, these lords, the daimyo, had control over their own taxation, had control over their own military, and were under the shogun and had to go visit him every other year or so and do various building projects for him, and they were had to pay obeisance. But it was not an authoritarian government. It was not a tyranny. And this is one of the things that Jeffrey Parker gets wrong in his book, but the book's nevertheless wonderful. So we have here a very complex system where the governance, the national governance, is primarily in the hands of the shogun, but it's dispersed with the daimyo. And I think that's important, because you begin to get some sort of resilience at different levels. The national government is the one that creates the closed system, recognizes the closed system. The domains are closer, they're smaller areas. They have to deal with the disasters in their area without creating peasant rebellion. And then underneath that domainal governance, there's yet another level of control, and that's in these largely autonomous villages. And this form of governance really interests me, because in these largely autonomous villages, there are no gentry. The samurai have been drawn into the castle towns, and that's in order to keep track of them, figure out where they are. You don't want them to be able to train the peasants to fight. You don't want them to be very close to the peasantry so they can rally the peasantry around them and go against the shogun. And so all the elite are stuck in the cities. And yes, of course, they send out lots of directives to the peasants and tell them what they can wear and how they have to behave, and they insist on all sorts of reports coming in, which of course increases the literacy, which is very interesting. But the village level, people have to figure out how to sustain their village in a very small area. So you get resilience right there in that small area, because they cannot move around very much. In fact, there is a whole system of internal passports that disallows their movement. So we have here different layers of resilience that are marked by different layers of governance. This government happens to be relatively predictable and non-corrupt, which helps. And it has an ideology which is interested principally in social stability and peace. And according to Neo-Confucian norms, good governance is about peace and stability. It is not about growth. It is certainly also not about democracy. It is not about abundance for the peasants. It is not about, let's see if we can make these peasants imagine wonderful futures for themselves and be educated. This is not, again, a utopia. But it's interesting how this ideology, which is not interested or doesn't pride itself on growth, then begins to produce systems of, for instance, where the tax rates remains exactly the same from the early 17th century to the 19th century, because you're not assuming that there's going to be growth in the village. It'll also be difficult to calculate that growth, and it'll go up against other people's interests. And that means that such that there is increases in well-being in the villages, they go to the villages. And that makes sense for the villagers to begin to think about more skillful use of the resources at hand. It will not be siphoned off by the elite. And in fact, what we end up having here is a rather unusual system, I think, in world history, whereby the elite's income remains pretty much the same, whereas the commoners' goods and well-being, and even their standard of living according to GDP, is beginning to rise. So we have greater egalitarianism between these classes, which I think is again an interesting template for thinking about what works with resilience. Greater egalitarianism seems to have helped.